Ready to rock? All right. A friend of mine, I was very nervous about this, and a friend said, it's just like you're a warm-up act for the Rolling Stones, and we'll see who the Rolling Stones are later. So, you probably heard this story, I apologize, but a pilot announces over the intercom, the good news, we're moving much faster than expected. The bad news, we have no idea where we're going. And the title of our festival, Rethinking Progress, implies that we share an idea of what progress means, but feel provoked by a crisis today to reconsider it. The crisis may require either acknowledging how we failed to live up to our legitimate hopes and ideals, or reimagining what progress itself should be all about, perhaps whether it's a worthy aspiration at all. As a philosopher who spends much of his time living in the past, I have the luxury of setting the table for our event by looking backwards at the development of our idea rather than taking out a crystal ball and predicting the future. Before we rethink progress, we should appreciate that the concept is itself a recent historical development of our species. After telling a story about the origins, I'll look at some critics who've been rethinking progress ever since the idea burst on the scene during the Enlightenment, most notably Romantics Nietzsche and Marx. And I'll conclude by asking whether there's anything new about rethinking progress today. For ancient cultures, we imagine, time was experienced not as a chronological abstraction, but viscerally, by way of cycles evident in our natural environment. Day and night are geared to our body's needs for activity and rest. Months show up in tidal ebbs and flows, the basis for navigation. The years go round and round by way of seasons that dictate opportune times for farming and hunting. Like days, months, and years, the biological time of an individual life happens in typical phases, though the direction is linear: birth, growth, reproduction, mature activity, aging, death. But the linear road of each life towards decline and oblivion finds some compensation in renewal through children who begin the process all over again. And though generations come and go, the human form appears to return forever. Larger cultural cycles, famine and plenty, peace and war, periods of relative justice and injustice, reinforce the sense that what goes round comes round, that there's nothing new under the sun. Because past experience teaches us what to expect in the future, it's possible for seasoned old people to have seen it all. And so it makes sense to respect our elders as the wisest teachers. Now, all organisms share in the life process, but only we humans must make sense of our lives by finding meaning in our fleeting moment on Earth. Myths have enabled us to secure our place in a cosmic order and our sense of importance within it as members of communities whose legitimacy is grounded in ancient origins, common ancestry, participation in a shared past, or spiritual kinship. Reverence for a sacred past is compatible with a cyclical sense of time if a group sees the future not as opening up something unprecedented, but as calling for a perpetual restoration of the ancient origin that provided its sacred ground. The modern idea of the march of progress involves a revolutionary rethinking of the meaning of history, but it adapts and secularizes two older religious ideas, Jewish messianism and Christian eschatology. Whereas the Greek philosophers made their peace with the vulnerability of human achievements by not expecting too much of history, given our tendency towards hubris, Jews and Christians introduced the idea of temporal directionality, made known to the world in a unique historical moment that changes everything, whether it be the revelation of divine law to Moses and the covenant establishing the Jewish people as chosen to take special responsibility for living righteously, or the resurrection of Jesus as the Christ who died for our sins and promises the eternal salvation of our souls if we follow his loving example. Now, despite their disagreements about the moment that changes time forever, Jews and Christians agree on this. Reason cannot establish that history, so apparently subject to chance, fate, suffering, and evil, unfolds according to a meaningful plan. Only faith in a transcendent power beyond the actual evidence of our violent history can redeem the harsh facts of life. And yet, despite its initial otherworldly message, Christianity proves to be a mighty this-worldly force when the church and empires collaborate, subjecting heathens to colonization, enslavement, and slaughter behind the pretense of saving souls and doing God's work. With the three revolutions, scientific, industrial, and political, that mark the birth of the modern era, enlightened minds come to believe that we can, through the autonomous use of reason and the artful exercise of our wills, bring about a world that provides comfort, security, freedom, and peace for all. We have the power to master nature and make history, and this promises to usher in an era that will not only be new, but also radically improved. The modern world sets its hope for progress not on faith in divine providence or spiritual betterment in heaven, but on political self-determination, material production, and welfare for future generations here on earth. Now, on the strongest model provided by Hegel, progress replaces providence. An immanent logic drives the course of time, guaranteeing that the slaughter bench of history provides necessary lessons as part of a learning process, a collective Bildungsroman that culminates in a happy ending, which happens to be Hegel's own time. For after all, the owl of Minerva only spreads her wings at the falling of dusk. According to Hegel, reason inheres in history and is actualized dialectically in the direction of freedom, a harmony between objective conditions, the modern state, civil society, and family, and modern people's subjective identification with their circumstances. On non-dialectical views, the Enlightenment's optimism is largely based on the success of the three revolutions in proving the efficacy of human agency, accelerating the extension of natural scientific explanation, increasingly gaining what Descartes so prophetically promised, the mastery of nature, reducing human misery by the application of its new science and technology, increasing the authority of appeals to reason in public life, reducing the divisive public role of religion, and extending the revolutionary claim of individual natural rights to an ever wider class of subjects. Nonetheless, an imperialist logic echoes the religious past. On the stadial view advocated by participants in the Scottish Enlightenment, all societies are destined to go through the same stages of development, but at different speeds. On a starker view, endorsed by Hegel and others, some societies are stuck in time, going nowhere, and are out of history altogether. Here, the previously discussed distinction between cyclical and linear temporalities is used to mark some societies as static, as having no history, because immersed in nature, they're incapable of rising to the more restless and self-reflective level of reason. A further distinction is drawn between barbarian cultures that are at least educable under the civilizing influence and those who are hopelessly spinning their wheels. Now, so far I've suggested that the modern ideas of progress represent the secularization of older religious notions of messianism and eschatology. This move enables enlightened moderns to look down upon so-called pre-modern cultures as lagging behind, either because they're stuck in a cyclical sense of time or because they are reliant on an outmoded faith in divine providence. And here's my second main point. Philosophers and artists have been rethinking this ideal of progress right from the get-go. Our topic, Rethinking Progress, was in effect the title of a debate in 1749. When Rousseau entered an essay contest sponsored by the Academy of Dijon, asking, has the restoration of the arts and sciences contributed to the refining of moral character? He won the prize, arguing that civilization had had a destructive influence on human beings, eroding our natural goodness and replacing it with vanity, competitiveness, and envy. And just at the moment in the 19th century, when Western European societies, for all their massive faults, seemed to be paying off the Enlightenment's promissory notes, dissatisfactions with modernity erupted in three forms. Romantics lamented that society, increasingly atomistic, materialistic, mechanized, and urbanized, was tearing people from their roots, coarsening their better sentiments, undermining communities, exploiting nature. Romantics looked back nostalgically to a time when, they imagined, individuals felt more in harmony with reality, either through sharing the blood, soil, and language of a particular culture or people, or going back to nature, or starting a utopian commune where small is beautiful. Thinkers like Nietzsche complained that modernity was not modern enough, for the restless, perpetually self-transforming, anomic spirit introduced by the Enlightenment's call to individual autonomy is compromised by its social structure, a herd society professing the Christian moralism of Kant, the calculating sobriety of utilitarians, the leveling longings of socialists. Nietzsche imagined what it could mean to live a creative, artistic life in a mass society that encouraged conformity. The Nazis appropriated him with the help of social Darwinism in the name of creating a superior race. Their resentful scapegoating of the weak in order to make themselves feel strong, their appeal to the herd mentality, their atavistic mythology would have appalled Nietzsche. National Socialism used all the tools of modernity, weapons, transportation, movies, and industrial factories to react against the cosmopolitan spirit of progressive modernity. Now, Marx sees the modern state as the administrative pawn of corporations in the capitalist marketplace. And so he imagines that a revolution that gave workers control over the social conditions of production would lead to an overcoming of alienation and the withering away of the state as we know it. He was prescient about the modern state as a servant of moneyed interests, a protector of class divisions. But his answer, communism, was flawed for reasons best elaborated by the late Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, who tells us, quote, "Fraternity under compulsion is the most malignant idea devised in modern times, the perfect path to totalitarian tyranny." So what's new? I'm actually on time. Although I don't lose the minutes that it took to get us going, right? Because then I'd have a minute. Which might be in the TED spirit. Anyhow, the 20th century opens up at least 3 lines of doubt about whether modernity ushers in an age of progress. First, the horrors of Nazism, Stalinism, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Mao's Cultural Revolution, the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge, among others, lead to a critique of totalizing ideologies, pathologies of reason, fueled by outbreaks of religious passion without religion. Second, debates about the effects of globalization in a post-colonial age lead to attempts to articulate a politics of difference, respectful of others than those under the Western orbit. Third, climate change and the prospect of ecological disaster invite critiques of technology and growth as expressions of an instrumental stance towards nature and a refusal to accept limits. So here we are today. Our time forces us to question whether we can have modern progress marked by the drives for freedom and material well-being without being destroyed by its apparent byproducts, violence, inequality, and ecological degradation. I believe we cannot turn our backs on the gains of modernity and the constitutional frameworks that protect negative liberty and the rights associated with it. But ours must be an ambivalent modernity, for we're more aware than ever that liberty unconstrained by social justice runs roughshod over the economically powerless, as if we can achieve progress at the expense of people. The liberal critique of Marxism has succeeded, for collectivist utopias ended in totalitarianism. But we need to remember the validity of Marx's critique of liberalism, for neoliberals' professed belief in deregulation, free markets, and a minimal state ends up concentrating power in the hands of corporate interests, providing socialism for the rich. Dignity as a measure of progress is an old-fashioned idea. Not how many wants we can fulfill, but how we as a society meet the basic need of human individuals for recognition, especially of those who are too weak and vulnerable to bargain their way into the social contract. In the words of the prophets, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, the poor. Now, as Leszek Kolakowski, a critic of communism, reminds us, the collapse of communism is no reason to scrap the idea of human fraternity. As a statement of solidarity with the underdogs and oppressed, as a motivation to oppose social Darwinism, as a light that keeps before our eyes something higher than competition and greed. For all these reasons, socialism, the ideal, not the system, still has its uses. And so too, I want to argue, does the much maligned notion of cyclical natural time, an idea that modern progressivists have consigned to the dustbin of history. Now, this is an idea whose time has come around again for two reasons. First, we find meaning in our lives not simply by seeing them as linear paths from birth to death, but by accepting our place in the cycle of generations. Meaning comes from both gratitude, thankfulness for what has been handed down to us from the past, and what Erik Erikson calls generativity, a sense of contributing to a future that will be there without ourselves, but where younger generations will renew the cycle. When what's new becomes the measure of improvement, the young, who are more with it, have a privilege over the old, who are perceived as being out of touch and set in their ways. Unable to count on past experience to tell us what we have reason to expect from the future, we become conscious of living in a transitional age. A successful person doesn't so much need experience as the ability to adapt to change and improvise. Because the accelerating pace of change corresponds to an increase in the speed of transportation and communication across distances. The identity of young people tends to be increasingly mobile and protean. Their elders are too often left in the dust to fend for themselves in isolated communities of old people. This is a tragic side effect of modernity's tendency to see age not as a source of wisdom that the community needs, but as a time to retire. Even if there's plenty that's new under the sun, we would be wise to respect the perspective that a long life can bring, especially as more people will be living longer. And finally, there's our natural environment itself as a place where we must learn to scale back and use our renewable resources more wisely. This need for limitation doesn't sit well with the liberty and material welfare we so prize, and it may pose our greatest challenge as we continue to rethink progress. On the one hand, we've made undeniable technological advances coupled with a surge in productivity and consumer purchasing power, and a burgeoning middle class in once underdeveloped countries who clamor to share in the consumer goods so available to Americans and Europeans. On the other hand, we know we are like a family living off of credit and well beyond our means. And we need to embrace the image of recycling. For as Hans Jonas, somebody who's from the New School, formerly from the New School, or Claire Potter hails from now, and who is somebody I've written about, as Hans Jonas puts it, it was once religion that told us we are all sinners because of original sin. It's now the ecology of our planet that pronounces us, all of us, to be sinners because of the excessive exploits of human inventiveness. It was once religion that threatened us a last judgment at the end of days. It's now our tortured planet that predicts the arrival of such a day without any heavenly intervention. The latest revelation from no Mount Sinai, from no Mount of the Sermon, from no bow tree of the Buddha, is the outcry of mute things that we must heed by curbing our powers over creation, lest we perish together on a wasteland of what was creation. These are old ideas. The dignity of an individual human life, the intergenerational rhythms of the life cycle, and nature itself as a site of recycling. But the task of rethinking progress today will be how to combine them successfully so that ethical responsibility can stand up to our ever-expanding power.